The doors of the grand ballroom swung open with a low, stately creak, and she stepped across the threshold with the delicate hesitancy of a moth approaching a flame. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls above the polished expanse, scattering light in 1,000 fractured rays that danced across the golden parquet floor. Every footfall echoed, measured, amplifying the sense of expectation that clung to her like the faint scent of jasmine on her gown. She had practiced this moment in the quiet of her chamber, imagining the applause, the whispers, the polite admiration of a society that had long watched her from afar, but the reality, the vastness, the glitter, the weight of all eyes upon her, was something no rehearsal could capture. Her gown shimmered in layers of soft ivory silk and gossamer lace, each fold embroidered with threads that caught the light and threw it back in subtle brilliance. A delicate train trailed behind her, brushing against the floor with each hesitant step. Her heart fluttered like a bird trapped within her, oscillating between delight and trepidation, between hope and the grim knowledge of what awaited her at the end of this week. At 23, she was young, and yet the world she had entered demanded from her a poise and sophistication she had only glimpsed in her dreams. The ballroom was alive with murmurs and laughter, a tide of satin and lace and polished boots, all moving in intricate patterns around her. Ladies curtsied, offered polite nods, and somewhere in the orchestra pit, a violinist's bow drew a note that trembled and lingered like a question suspended in air. She could feel eyes following her, some admiring, some calculating, some simply curious, and she lowered her lashes, aware of how vulnerable one could feel under such scrutiny. He was there before she fully realized it, a presence that seemed to command the room even as he remained still. The Duke. At 30, his reputation preceded him like a shadow, cold, meticulous, a man whose detachment had become legend among the circles of wealth and power. He stood near the far end of the room, dressed in tailored midnight blue, a sash of understated silver tracing across his chest. His posture was impeccable, rigid yet fluid, as if the very air around him recognized his authority. And yet his gaze, when it found hers, was not just observing. It measured, it penetrated, it unsettled. A shiver traveled down her spine, a mingling of fear and fascination, and she realized with a start that no amount of etiquette could shield her from the effect of his presence. She tried to steady herself as she approached, each step rehearsed yet impossible to perfect. Her maid's quiet whisper at her ear, reminding her to breathe, was a tiny anchor amidst the swirl of gold and crystal. The Duke's eyes never wavered, tracing her movements with an intensity that made her cheeks flush beneath her powder and blush. When he finally moved, it was imperceptible, almost casual, yet it carried a weight that drew the attention of even the closest onlookers. He stopped before her, and for a heartbeat, the world contracted to the space between them. His hand extended, gloved, elegant, formal, a gesture that demanded she place hers within it. The moment her fingers brushed against his, the contact was electric and oddly clinical, a combination of warmth and distance that left her senses tingling. He guided her into position, posture perfect, and then leaned closer, so close that the warmth of his breath brushed her ear, carrying with it words that made her blood run cold. "This marriage is only for 1 week, then you leave." The ballroom, the music, the murmurs, all seemed to fade, leaving only the echo of those words and the sudden, sharp intake of her own breath. She could barely summon a reply, her voice trapped in the tangle of shock and disbelief. She had known intellectually that this arrangement was temporary, a union of convenience dictated by alliances and duty, but hearing it spoken with such clarity, so final, so unyielding, was a blow she had not prepared for. Her hands, still resting lightly against his, felt suddenly weightless, as if she could dissolve into the polished floor beneath her. He straightened, his expression a mask of composure, though in the briefest flicker of his dark eyes, there was something almost imperceptibly human, a hint of regret, or perhaps of anticipation, she could not tell which. Around them, the society resumed its rhythm, conversations floating back into her awareness, but she could not shake the sudden vertigo of knowing how deliberately her heart had been bracketed into a week's span. A week of glances, of dances, of proximity that promised nothing beyond its temporal limit. The orchestra shifted, a soft waltz swelling through the room, and the Duke inclined his head, gesturing that she join him. The dance began, each step precise, the music guiding their movements in a formal pattern that mirrored the rigid expectations of their families. She followed, attempting the fluidity she had learned in lessons, but each motion felt constrained, as if the very fabric of her gown confined her in more ways than one. His hand at her back was firm yet detached, his other hand entwined with hers, guiding, correcting, asserting authority without tenderness. Yet within this rigid dance, subtle signs emerged, small, almost imperceptible shifts that suggested he was not entirely immune to the strange alchemy forming between them. A brief flicker of his lips, an unguarded glance when he thought she was not looking, a slight loosening of posture in moments when they were briefly alone amid the crowd. She noted each of these anomalies with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, recognizing the humanity beneath his reputation, the hints of a man constrained by expectation as much as she was. Guests clinked glasses in the distance, laughter like delicate chimes punctuating the space around them, but she felt removed from it, suspended in a private, tension-filled bubble. Every subtle motion, every whispered instruction, every fleeting brush of their fingers carried meaning. She became acutely aware of the contrasts in him, commanding yet not cruel, distant yet observant, formal yet capable of unspoken acknowledgement. Her own heart responded in kind, cautious but intrigued, a tiny spark in the vast, gilded emptiness. When the dance concluded, he released her hand with the same precise care he had shown throughout, stepping back just far enough to allow propriety to resume. She the skirts of her gown fanning out in a perfect arc, and though the world expected her to smile, to nod, to conform, she found herself momentarily lost, her thoughts consumed not by applause but by the weight of his words and the shadowed promise behind them. She to a balcony overlooking the city as soon as the music allowed, seeking a moment of solitude amidst the grandeur. The cool night air pressed against her cheeks, carrying with it the sense of the gardens below, the faint tang of smoke from distant chimneys, and the muted echo of laughter and music that seemed both distant and intimate. She pressed a gloved hand to her chest, feeling the rapid pulse beneath her ribs, and let herself think freely, away from the eyes of the ball, away from the meticulous scrutiny of a man who measured her worth with a glance. Memories of her childhood flashed unbidden, soft light filtering through curtains, the warmth of her mother's hands, the steady, reassuring tone of her father's voice. She had imagined marriage as a portal to a world beyond the narrow corridors of her upbringing, a chance for adventure, for love, for autonomy. And yet here she was, standing in a palace of mirrors and crystal, bound not by love but by duty, by a week-long agreement that seemed at once both cruel and precise. Her maid, ever vigilant, appeared quietly at the edge of the balcony, offering a soft smile, a subtle hand resting briefly on her shoulder. "Breathe," she whispered, a word heavy with encouragement and empathy. The bride nodded, inhaling deeply, attempting to gather the fragments of composure that remained, though her mind refused to settle. She was acutely aware of the path laid before her, a week of constrained interactions, delicate negotiations of glances and gestures, a dance as exacting as any in the ballroom, but infinitely more complex in consequence. As the first hours of their union passed, she began to notice subtleties in the Duke's behavior that suggested the veneer of cold detachment was not impenetrable. The way he occasionally adjusted his posture when speaking with her, the brief moments when his expression softened before returning to its controlled mask, the almost imperceptible attentiveness to her comfort, all hinted at an internal landscape hidden behind the meticulous exterior. And yet, she reminded herself, these were but glimpses, fragile and fleeting, within a week destined to end in separation. The night deepened, the ballroom gradually emptying of those who had come for spectacle rather than intimacy. Candles burned low along the walls, flickering shadows across the marble and gilded moldings. She found herself lingering near a set of French windows, hands resting lightly on the polished sill, watching the moon's reflection ripple across the garden fountains. The contrast between the ordered opulence of the ball and the wild, indifferent beauty of the world outside struck her with sudden poignancy. She realized that for all the decorum, all the meticulous planning and ritual, neither she nor the Duke could fully contain the stirrings of their own hearts. A quiet sound behind her signaled his approach. She turned to find him standing a few paces away, his gaze steady, measured. He spoke not with the formal precision of the ballroom, but with a tone so low and deliberate it demanded attention. "Do you truly understand what is expected of you this week?" The question was not rhetorical. It carried the weight of responsibility, of unspoken stakes, of futures held in balance. She nodded, words failing her, and in that silence a complex dialogue passed between them. Challenge, curiosity, and the faintest trace of acknowledgement that perhaps this week, though defined by limitation, would be anything but ordinary. The cool night air seemed to pulse around them, as if the palace itself held its breath. She realized with an unexpected sharpness that the emotional journey ahead would test every notion of composure, courage, and heart she possessed. In that suspended moment, she felt the strange thrill of both fear and possibility, of anticipation mingled with trepidation, and the quiet understanding that nothing in the days to come would be simple, yet every moment might reveal more than either of them had dared hope. As the moonlight fell across their entwined shadows, her chest rose and fell with a mixture of apprehension and strange excitement, and the Duke, ever composed, allowed for a brief, almost imperceptible smile to touch his lips. Neither spoke further, for words were insufficient to capture the delicate, volatile, and unexpected spark that had already begun to take root. She returned inside, glancing once more at the dance floor where the echoes of music lingered like a promise unfulfilled. Somewhere amid the polished marble and whispered etiquette, a new, fragile awareness had been sown, that even in a week bound by duty, the human heart might chart its own course. The doors of the ballroom closed behind her with a soft, resonant thud, and for the first time she truly understood the paradox she faced. A week was fleeting, finite, yet within it, infinite possibilities awaited, and at the very center of that storm of light, shadow, and whispered expectation stood the man whose glance had already begun to unravel her carefully rehearsed defenses. She drew in a steadying breath, aware that the days ahead would demand all her courage, all her patience, and perhaps most frighteningly, all of her heart. And then, as she prepared to take her leave of the balcony and the moonlit garden beyond, she heard it again, the quietest murmur of thought, a voice unbidden yet unmistakable. A week, and then we must part. The words reverberated through her mind, a solemn rhythm against the pulse of her heart, and in that suspended silence she realized the first shift had already begun. The world had changed with a single whisper, and there was no turning back. The morning sunlight filtered through the tall, arched windows, catching on the polished silver and porcelain of the breakfast table, illuminating the delicate steam rising from the teacups. She entered the dining hall with careful poise, her gown softer now in muted cream tones, the silk slightly creased from the previous evening's dance. Her heart, still tender from the whispered words of the Duke, beat with a strange mixture of apprehension and resolve. Across the room he already stood, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve with deliberate precision, the morning light casting a subtle halo along his sharp jawline. For all his composed demeanor, there was a quiet watchfulness in his eyes as they met hers across the table. The breakfast was ceremonious, the clink of cutlery punctuating silences heavy with expectation. She nibbled delicately on buttered toast, aware that every gesture was under observation. His hand occasionally brushed against his own teacup, his fingers resting with a poise that seemed effortless, yet each subtle movement felt charged with intent. Conversation was minimal, polite, and formal, but beneath the surface, a tentative rhythm began to emerge. He asked about her journey to the estate, inquiring about the landscape, the carriage ride, questions that seemed innocuous but carried the faintest suggestion of genuine interest. She answered cautiously, revealing just enough to maintain propriety while testing the limits of his engagement. By mid-morning, the estate gardens called to them, and she found herself walking beside him through a labyrinth of roses and clipped hedges. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of dew and blooming flowers, each inhalation invigorating and calming simultaneously. Birds trilled from unseen branches, and the soft rustle of leaves underfoot was punctuated by the occasional distant bark of a hound. He maintained a composed distance, yet his eyes lingered on her, tracing her silhouette, noting the slight crease of worry between her brows, the gentle tilt of her head when she observed the sunlight filtering through the trees. "Do you often find solace in gardens?" he asked, his voice low, measured, yet somehow warmer than it had ever been in the ballroom's gilded echo. She paused, considering her response, aware that even this small exchange was laden with meaning. "I do," she admitted softly, though rarely with such grandeur surrounding them. "Gardens feel honest, untamed yet contained, like a secret kept in plain sight." His lips curved subtly, the barest trace of a smile, and for a heartbeat, the formal mask he wore cracked, revealing the faintest glimpse of curiosity, perhaps even admiration. Days passed in a measured swirl of duties and encounters, each designed to uphold appearances, yet each layered with quiet, almost imperceptible intimacy. They attended luncheons where the Duke's acquaintances dissected politics and estates, their words laced with polite intrigue. In these moments, she learned to navigate the currents of his world, understanding the rhythms of conversation, the subtle hierarchies of attention. He in turn offered small gestures, ensuring her was full, directing a servant to assist with her coat, adjusting the angle of her chair so she might sit with ease, actions almost too slight to notice, yet laden with a weight that warmed her chest in ways she did not fully comprehend. Evenings brought the faint scent of candle wax and the flicker of lamplight against gilded mirrors, the polished floor reflecting the couple's silhouettes as they practiced dances meant to impress visiting dignitaries. At first, every step was cautious, calculated, each movement steeped in tension. Yet slowly, as the week progressed, the dance evolved from mere formality into an unspoken conversation. A gentle correction here, a fleeting brush of fingers there, eyes meeting in brief acknowledgement of mutual understanding. Each gesture deepened the fragile thread forming between them. He allowed her occasional liberties, moments where she led the rhythm, and she began to sense the quiet pride he felt in her grace and precision. One afternoon, in a shadowed corridor seldom traversed by guests, he stopped abruptly. The hush of the estate seemed to swell around them, the distant clatter of a servant's steps fading into insignificance. "I did not intend for you to see this," he murmured, gesturing toward a series of faded sketches pinned to the wall, childhood drawings, landscapes captured in careful strokes, tender glimpses of a past unguarded. Her eyes widened, heart clenching with the intimacy of the revelation. He rarely allowed anyone beyond the veneer of perfection he maintained, yet here she stood, entrusted with the private contours of his youth. I had no idea you drew," she said, voice barely audible. She reached out, fingertips hovering above the paper as though contact might shatter the fragile trust. He shook his head faintly, expression unreadable. "It is not important," he said, yet the softness in his tone belied the dismissal. "But it is truth, something I cannot discard." In that corridor with the shadows dancing along stone walls, she glimpsed not the commanding duke, the man shaped by society's expectations, but a human being, vulnerable, shaped by past loss and private dreams. Their adventures extended beyond the gardens and corridors. On the fifth day, he insisted she join him on horseback, the animal's warmth beneath her thighs, the wind tangling her hair, freedom mingling with trepidation. At first, she faltered, unsure of the rhythm, her body stiff with caution. Yet he guided her patiently, voice low and encouraging, hands correcting only when necessary, never overbearing. A smile slipped past his controlled demeanor when she stumbled in mirth, and in that laughter, a new bridge formed, a connection unspoken yet deeply felt. The sun caught on his coat and hat, dust motes dancing like golden confetti around them, and she realized that for all his formality, he was capable of joy, of lightness, of shared mirth. Yet the week was not without tension. At a formal dinner on the sixth evening, a minor slight, an unintentional comment, a misinterpreted glance ignited a subtle storm. Her cheeks flushed, his expression hardened for a moment, and the room, oblivious to the underlying current, continued its dance of etiquette. They exchanged few words afterward, retreating into their private chambers, each wrestling with emotions they had only just begun to acknowledge. In the silence, the walls of propriety pressed in, leaving them to navigate the tumultuous terrain of newly awakened sentiment. Night brought them together in unexpected intimacy. She found him alone in the library, candlelight casting a golden haze over rows of leather-bound volumes. Words spilled between them, tentative, hesitant, exploring boundaries, fears, memories. He spoke of burdens carried, of alliances forged in cold calculation, of mistakes made and lessons learned. She listened, offering her own reflections, her own vulnerabilities, discovering that beneath the armor of decorum, they were both prisoners of expectation and longing. By the flickering firelight, their hands brushed, a fleeting contact charged with recognition, an acknowledgement that what had begun as an arrangement was evolving into something far more complex. The penultimate evening drew them to a secluded terrace, overlooking the estate grounds bathed in moonlight. The scent of night-blooming jasmine hung in the air, mingling with the faint chill of spring. The world below was a tapestry of shadows and light, the distant hum of the town muted by the rolling hills. Here, stripped of audience and formality, he allowed himself a gesture entirely uncalculated, offering her a small, delicate locket, simple in design, yet imbued with the weight of significance. "For remembrance," he said softly, the words an anchor amidst the turbulence of the week. She accepted it, fingers brushing his, eyes meeting his in a long-held gaze that carried the unspoken acknowledgement of their shared journey. In those 7 days, moments of levity punctuated tension. A misbehaving spaniel overturned a vase, sending water across the polished floor. They laughed together, the sound startlingly pure against the backdrop of the stately estate. In another instance, during a carriage ride along the winding estate paths, she dared a small wager over the speed of their horses, and he indulged her, the rare flash of competition softening his stoic exterior. Each shared experience, no matter how fleeting, etched lines of familiarity and trust, slowly bridging the chasm between arrangement and affection. By the 6th day, the quiet mornings together had evolved into a ritual. They walked the gardens before breakfast, exchanged glances over tea, shared unspoken acknowledgement of the week's constraints and possibilities. The Duke, ever meticulous, allowed subtle allowances, moments where he lingered near her side, permitted her laughter to echo unguarded, even offered a hand in gentle guidance when she faltered in movement. These small concessions, almost invisible to others, carried immense weight, a language of care developing in the spaces between formality. Yet as the week drew to its zenith, the specter of parting loomed ever larger. Each interaction carried an undercurrent of bittersweet urgency, a sense that time's cruel passage would demand acknowledgement of what they had built. She began to sense his internal struggle, the way his hand would tighten slightly over the railing when she leaned near, the subtle pause before responding to her questions, the rare moments when his gaze softened, betraying a longing he could not name aloud. Likewise, she wrestled with the duality of her emotions. the pull of duty and propriety against the stirrings of a heart increasingly invested, increasingly unwilling to remain distant. On the seventh evening, a private dinner was arranged, the table set near the bay windows overlooking the estate's sprawling grounds. Candles flickered in crystal holders, casting reflections that danced across the silverware. The Duke poured wine with meticulous care, offering her first a delicate sip, an act both courteous and intimate. Words were fewer now, their conversation heavy with meaning, weighted with the unspoken acknowledgement of the fleeting nature of their time together. In that quiet, they explored nuances of affection, small confessions, the tentative admissions of a week lived in close proximity, each revelation deepening the fragile bond between them. The night sky stretched wide above them, stars like frozen fire suspended in velvet blackness. She leaned slightly, feeling the warmth of his presence beside her, the quiet steadiness of his hand resting near hers. The week had been a whirlwind, formalities, dances, laughter, revelations, and shared vulnerabilities, but within that tempest had emerged a clarity neither had expected. The human heart, even when constrained by duty, sought connection, understanding, and intimacy. When the candles burned low and the final toast was made, they rose together, moving toward the terrace once more. The wind carried a hint of spring rain, dampening the sense of jasmine and grass, and she shivered slightly, drawing closer to him. Their eyes met, a dialogue of longing and resignation playing out in the quiet distance between breaths. The Duke, ever composed, allowed his mask to falter for a brief heartbeat, a fleeting glimpse of desire tempered by inevitability. As the night deepened, she felt the weight of the coming dawn, the final hours of a week that had transformed them both. In the stillness, they acknowledged what words could not fully express, the fragile, complicated bond that had been forged in 7 days of proximity, intimacy, and shared vulnerability. Each gesture, glance, and whispered word had layered upon the other, creating a tapestry of connection that the confines of duty and expectation. And yet, even as they stood together, poised on the terrace with the world hushed around them, a single truth remained immutable. In less than 24 hours, the week would end, and with it, the certainty of separation. The Duke's hand brushed hers, a contact brief yet searing, and she understood with sudden clarity that the whirlwind of days behind them had changed everything. Hearts had been awakened, boundaries tested, and in the quiet storm of their week, a fragile bond had formed, threatening to outlast the limits imposed by duty. She looked up at him, searching his expression for clues, for signs of intention, for any hint of the man behind the formal exterior she had come to know and respect. His gaze was steady, unreadable yet charged, a silent question passing between them. She realized then that the week, with all its orchestrated encounters, unexpected laughter, and shared confidences, had delivered something neither of them had anticipated, a confrontation with the very depths of their own hearts. And as the first drops of rain began to streak the terrace windows, glinting in the candlelight like fragile diamonds, she felt the weight of inevitability press gently yet insistently upon her. The whirlwind of the week had left them poised at the edge of something undefined, something potent, something that would demand reckoning when the morrow came. In that suspended moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting, as she and the Duke faced the quiet storm of possibility and the unspoken promise of what might yet unfold. Dawn broke slowly across the estate, soft pale light spilling over the manicured gardens and gilded rooftops, touching the marble with the warmth of reluctant farewell. She awoke first, the familiar quilt still wrapped around her shoulders, the faint scent of lilac and beeswax lingering from the morning's lighting. The realization pressed upon her with a quiet, insistent weight. This was the final day, the culmination of a week that had changed everything, yet threatened to leave nothing lasting. Her pulse quickened at the thought of facing him again, of navigating the delicate tension that had been woven between them in the span of 7 days. In the breakfast hall, the Duke already waited, the faint outline of the sun glinting off the polished silver of his sleeve buttons. He looked up as she entered, expression unreadable, a mask of composed civility that could not fully disguise the storm beneath. His gaze lingered on her with something more than duty, a recognition, a claim unspoken yet impossible to ignore. They seated themselves across from one another, the distance polite yet electric, each aware of the fragile tension threaded between gestures and silences. The table was laden with delicacies, yet neither seemed able to focus entirely on food. Words were sparse, measured, each one carrying weight, each one a careful probe into the uncharted territories of heart and obligation. After breakfast, the estate grounds beckoned once more. They walked side by side through the gardens, where dew sparkled like shattered crystal on the petals of early blooms. The air was crisp with the promise of spring, carrying the faint scent of roses and wet earth. Their hands brushed occasionally, tentative, a silent acknowledgement of the intimacy they had nurtured over the week. He spoke softly, carefully, about the paths that would soon diverge, about responsibilities that could not be ignored, about the expectations that bound them both. and in her silence he found his answer. She understood, yet her eyes betrayed the ache of a heart unwilling to let go. The carriage awaited for their final engagement of the week, a formal gathering meant to mirror the grandness of the wedding ball. She stepped into the polished wood, silk skirts rustling, and felt the cool weight of anticipation settle in her chest. The ride through the winding estate paths was punctuated by the rhythmic clip of hooves, the distant call of birds, and the low murmur of the Duke beside her. His posture was impeccable, yet the hand nearest hers twitched slightly, betraying the tension he kept carefully masked beneath stoic composure. For the first time, she dared to reach for it, brushing fingers against his, and felt a spark ignite, a recognition of shared longing tempered by the imminence of separation. The ball itself glittered with an almost oppressive opulence. Chandeliers reflected light onto the polished floor, and guests murmured in their intricate patterns of admiration and calculation. She moved through the crowd with the grace learned over the week, yet every step was haunted by the knowledge that this final dance might define more than appearance or etiquette. It might define the fragile thread connecting two hearts forged under constraint. The Duke joined her at the center of the room, his hand warm, his eyes unwavering. The orchestra began a waltz, soft at first, swelling with emotion as their bodies moved in precise yet intimate rhythm. Each step, each turn was laden with a delicate tension. In the span of the music, memories of the week surged. The whispered conversations in shadowed corridors, the shared laughter at minor mishaps, the quiet mornings in the gardens, the tentative confessions by candlelight. The dance became more than a performance. It became a conversation, an unspoken declaration of all that had passed and all that might be lost. He guided her gently, yet allowed her moments of autonomy, each yielding an intimate acknowledgement of trust and understanding. Their faces remained poised, yet in fleeting glances, they communicated what words could not, a connection profound, fragile, and fleeting. As the final notes of the waltz drifted into silence, he led her to the terrace overlooking the estate, where the moonlight mingled with the first hints of a lingering dawn. The wind carried a faint scent of jasmine, soft and insistent, and the dew glistened on the grass like tiny lanterns guiding the way. The silence between them was not empty. It thrummed with anticipation, with the weight of unspoken emotion, with the awareness of the inevitability to come. She looked up at him, searching for a sign, a clue, a fissure in his unyielding composure, and found instead a mirror of her own tumultuous longing reflected in his steady gaze. He reached for her hand, this time without hesitation, and held it firmly yet tenderly. "We have spent 7 days," he said, voice low, measured, yet heavy with meaning, 7 days that have altered the course of everything, and tomorrow we must face the reality our families have imposed. His thumb brushed over her knuckles, a gesture intimate and grounding, and she felt the pulse of life between them, urgent and undeniable. She nodded, unable to speak, heart constricting under the weight of inevitability. The moments that followed were a careful negotiation of presence and restraint. They wandered the terrace in silence, their fingers intertwined, steps slow, deliberate, aware that each second counted. She dared to venture closer, allowing herself the briefest contact, and he responded with subtle warmth, the stoic barrier he had maintained over the week softening under the quiet insistence of shared vulnerability. There was no need for flourish or declaration. In the simplicity of touch and gaze, they spoke volumes of what had grown between them. Yet the shadow of the week's impending end could not be ignored. At the edge of the terrace, he paused, facing her fully. The soft drizzle of early morning mist dampened the stone beneath their feet, and her hair clung in delicate tendrils to her cheeks. His eyes searched hers, intent, unflinching. "You will leave," he said quietly, almost reluctantly, as the agreement dictates. "But he faltered, the first crack in the wall of composure that had shielded him from vulnerability all week. "I am not certain my heart will permit me to let you go." The admission struck her with a raw force, a mixture of relief, fear, and longing. She felt her own defenses crumble, revealing the depth of the bond forged in days so brief, yet infinitely potent. They returned inside for the final breakfast, a muted, solemn affair compared to the pomp of prior mornings. Each gesture was deliberate, each word weighed against the inevitability that the clock was mercilessly counting down. She watched him closely, noting the subtle tension in his posture, the rare flicker of uncertainty in his gaze. She realized then that the week had transformed not just her own heart, but his as well. His rigidity softened, his precision tempered by the awareness of feeling he could not fully articulate. As the carriage prepared to depart, the estate awash in the soft glow of morning, she stepped toward it with trembling resolve. The Duke stood at the threshold, hands folded, eyes unreadable yet electric with emotion. Guests lingered, oblivious to the storm of feeling between the two figures, and she felt the full weight of what it meant to leave. 7 days distilled into a single heartbeat, a single choice, a single farewell. She extended her hand tentatively, and he took it in his own, the contact lingering, defying the constraints imposed by society and expectation. The ride away from the estate was suffused with unspoken dialogue. They sat in silence, yet the tension between them hummed with life, a fragile thread connecting hearts that had been awakened to possibilities neither had anticipated. The landscape passed in blurred greens and golds, the rhythmic clip of hooves a grounding counterpoint to the storm of emotion within her. She dared to glance at him, noting the taut line of his jaw, the shadowed intensity of his eyes, and felt the realization settle fully. This week had changed everything, yet offered no promise beyond memory. She reached into the folds of her skirts and retrieved the locket he had given her, clasping it to her chest. Its cool weight was a talisman, a reminder of the fragile intimacy that had been nurtured in moments private, tender, and fleeting. He observed her with a careful neutrality, yet in the subtle tension of his shoulders, the way his fingers pressed against his own lap, there was a language unspoken but understood. The bond they had forged could not be undone by distance, even if the world insisted upon separation. Upon arrival at her family's estate, the carriage doors opened with a gentle thud, and she stepped onto the cobblestones, the weight of expectation immediately pressing upon her. She turned to see him remain in the carriage, his expression as calm and composed as ever, yet the intensity of his gaze betrayed the conflict waging within. Guests and servants moved around them, yet time seemed to stretch and suspend, capturing the moment in a liminal space between duty and desire, between farewell and hope. Her hand rose instinctively, a delicate gesture of acknowledgement, and he mirrored it with perfect symmetry. For a heartbeat, the world held still, suspended on the fragile bridge of shared emotion. Then the carriage door closed, leaving her alone on the cobblestones, the echo of the past week resonating in the rhythm of her pulse. The locket against her heart seemed to vibrate with the memory of every glance, every touch, every whispered word, a reminder that the whirlwind of days past had left an indelible mark on both of them. Even as she moved into the safety of her family's halls, the images of the Duke lingered, the flash of his dark eyes in the candlelight, the warmth of his hand brushing against hers, the restrained smile that had hinted at feeling beyond duty. She realized, with a mixture of melancholy and wonder, that a week had been sufficient to awaken something neither time nor distance could easily extinguish. The certainty of departure hung over her, yet within it lay the seed of possibility, a fragile hope that hearts so deeply stirred might find a path back to one another. In the quiet of her chamber, she allowed herself to sink onto a cushioned chair, fingers brushing the locket once more. Her mind replayed the sequence of events, the subtle evolutions of interaction, the tender confessions whispered in shadowed corners. Each memory was a fragment, a jewel of experience that had transformed her perception of love, of vulnerability, of the capacity for connection even under the strictest limitations. She felt herself changed, tempered and strengthened, yet aching with the knowledge that the week had ended with so much unresolved, so much unsaid. Across the miles, the Duke rode back toward his own estate, eyes fixed on the horizon, the wind tugging at his coat and hat. He thought of her with a force that surprised even him, of the locket clasped to her heart, of the way her laughter had resonated in corridors once steeped in silence, of the moments when he had allowed himself to be human in ways society demanded he conceal. He understood with undeniable clarity that the arrangement had been intended as finite, practical, yet it had yielded an emotional truth that boundaries, connection, once forged, did not dissolve with mere distance. In the twilight of that final day, both stood alone in their respective domains, hearts thrumming with unspoken questions and unacknowledged longing. The week had delivered a whirlwind of formality, intimacy, revelation, and conflict, and yet the story was far from complete. A subtle rain began to fall on the estate grounds, streaking windows with liquid diamonds, mirroring the tears they had not yet allowed themselves to shed. Somewhere amid the hush of twilight and the quiet stir of wind in the trees, the awareness settled like a gentle tremor. Love, once awakened, could not be bound by agreements, nor constrained by the passage of time. And in that suspended moment, as moonlight mingled with the silver of rain, she and the Duke each realized the truth that had crystallized in the crucible of 7 days. A week had been too brief to fully measure the depth of feeling, too fleeting to contain the burgeoning bond that now tethered their hearts. Yet it had been enough to awaken possibility, enough to etch an indelible mark upon their souls, and enough to set into motion a course that neither could ignore. The locket glinted in her hand, a symbol of memory and hope, while across the countryside, his hand rested on the railing of his carriage, mirroring the contact she would forever associate with desire and restraint. The storm of the past week had passed, leaving in its wake a calm suffused with tension and potential. The world awaited them both, a realm of obligations and expectations, yet beneath it all thrummed the quiet insistence of the human heart, that love, fragile yet resilient, would seek a path forward, regardless of constraints. And as the rain intensified, glistening along cobblestones and leaves, the final, unspoken question hovered in the space between them, powerful and unresolved. Would duty demand they part, or would the force that had awakened within 7 brief days carve a future neither could have anticipated? And in that suspended, silvered moment, the first true smile touched her lips, fragile yet resolute, as if acknowledging the storm survived, the bond forged, and the promise lingering somewhere just beyond the horizon.